And so there was a very exciting set of papers. I mean, usually I'm a little too Washington to speak about an exciting set of papers, but in this case, there genuinely was an exciting set of papers in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, led by David, under this heading of Rebuilding Macroeconomic Theory. And we agreed, and we're delighted to have David Vines with us to present sort of the overview of the project and some of the key thinking that came out of it. This is the American premiere, as it were, of the project, even though, of course, the aficionados have been reading the papers for a while. That'll be followed by Olivier giving some comments, and we have, I won't call out by name, but we have some very distinguished people in the audience for ongoing on-the-record discussion after the presentations. Just to make clear, David Vines is Professor of Economics and a Fellow of Balliol College at Oxford. He's an adjunct professor of economics at Australia National University. He's with CPR. He has his MA and PhD from Cambridge. And so he was one of the two conveners of this special January double issue of the Oxford Review of Economic Policy. More broadly, when I had the privilege to serve at the Bank of England for 3 years, David was one of those people who we listened to some and we knew we should have listened to more. And so it's been great having him engage in moving the field forward. After David's presentation, we're going to have remarks by Olivier Blanchard, who is, of course, the Bergsten Senior Fellow here at the Peterson Institute. Prior to joining the Institute, he was the Economic Counselor and Director of the Research Department at the IMF, and he remains the Robert M. Solow Professor of Economics Emeritus at MIT. And he's, of course, not only motivated to rebuild macroeconomic theory and rethink macroeconomic policy, but to make sure the rest of us understand why he's doing it and how he's doing it. And it's been a learning experience for all of us to have Olivier continuing to rethink and rebuild. So I look forward to hearing his latest on that as well. Thank you. David.
Thank you very much, Adam. And it's a very great pleasure to be here to talk with you this afternoon. During the Great Moderation, the new Keynesian dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, the DSG model to all of us, became the benchmark model, one that we taught to graduate students. But when the, can you, thank you very much. Is that better?
Nudge.
Great, thank you. And there we are, straight ahead like that. Perfect, terrific. When the crisis happened, this model made us all look really rather foolish. It didn't say very much about why the crisis happened, and it continued to be not very useful in thinking about why the recovery has been so slow. And so a group of us got together, a number of people, to think about this, including Olivier, who played a really important part in bringing this group of people together. And we all asked them, what do you make of the DSG model? And nearly all of them said, not good enough. And what to do next? And nearly all of them went in all sorts of different directions. And it was our job to try and see whether there's some general picture that emerges. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about pretty briefly today. I'm going to first of all talk about some history of past crises. And then I'm going to talk about in what way we need to build a different kind of model. And I'm going to end by talking about the implications of this for people who do policy building work in policy institutions like central banks. What I'm going to say largely builds on the papers in the OXREP issue. And let me say that it's online and free at the moment. So you can simply Google it and go online and pull up.
Simply go to the Peterson Institute website where for the moment you can get it.
You could get the link, thanks. Terrific. Let's begin with thinking about two past paradigm shifts, two past crises. think back to the 1930s when Keynes identified that the Marshallian method of partial equilibrium market by market wouldn't do the business. And his problem was to understand how and why the economy didn't return to equilibrium then in the 30s in the way that existing models said. And we now know what was central to invent the new method, consumption function, to do multiplier analysis and to think about liquidity preference as a way of preventing the interest rate from preserving full employment. And this produced a new general equilibrium model, ISLM, and it produced a new role for policy. Faced with the problem unemployment, you create a new paradigm and you end up with a new set of policy stories, narratives about what to do. If you compare that with what happened in the 1970s and 1980s, it was very different. There was a problem then, just like there had been in the 1930s. The problem in the 70s and 80s was inflation, and the fixed price ISLM model wasn't any good for talking about that adequately. But the response was much less straightforward than it had been in the 30s. The first set of responses came from, I was going to say people like me, traditionalists, the saltwater people in the US, those who saw what they observed as requiring a modification of what they'd done already. They added a Phillips curve, made it vertical in the long run, had a story about adaptive expectations, and also were very clear that they understood how and why economic growth happens. They'd been working with the Solow model and by then the Ramsey model and other models. What this new set of thinking created was the inflation targeting regime and an understanding that this should be pursued by monetary policy primarily rather than the fiscal policy that the Keynesian revolution had led to, and we understand the reasons why that happened. And many supply-side reforms on the growth side, on the supply side, to help think about growth. So again, a problem, an adaptation of that traditional model, inflation targeting as a policy response coupled with other policies. But not everyone was like us. There were others, the freshwater lot, who thought that what this called into question was the entire Keynesian active way of doing policy. And there was a very radical change of paradigm for these people arising out of the Lucas critique. Microfounded models, optimizing models, forward-looking ones, with the requirement that the model be consistent in that those who were modeled had a forward-looking, consistent, rational expectation of what would happen as described by the model. This more radical push has largely been accepted with huge implications. There was also, going with this approach, a change of method and of policy, and a view that the economy was in equilibrium and didn't require policy intervention. The first of the radical proposals arising from the Lucas critique largely accepted. The second overturned in a really fundamental way by Fisher, Taylor, Calvo, and many, arguing that even though people look forward, as long as there's lack of synchronicity in the setting of wages and prices, there will be nominal rigidities and there is ground for policy intervention. And the outcome of this much more radical view was to bolt on the microfoundations requirement to the view of the world that the traditionalists, me and many others, had come to in a much less radical way. And having done that, we ended up with the new Keynesian benchmark model that was in place as the crisis developed in 2008, put together during the Great Moderation, there and ready, and as I said at the beginning of the talk, not enough, not good enough. We know now very clearly, and we knew then, how this story works. It has an IS curve, just as we'd learned to have for many years. This, importantly, has both a representative consumer. Why the representative comes from the consumer comes from the microfoundations approach, but also investment. It's not Gali, Clarida, and Gertler and a simple three-equation story that so many of us do in introductory courses. There is investment driven by Tobin's Q, which is influenced by the interest rate and how that relates to the marginal product of capital, and by adjustment costs in the way capital evolves through investment. There's a natural level of output. There's a vertical Phillips curve. Aggregate demand can differ from output. I'll say that again. Aggregate demand can differ from the supply side potential, and that output gap can give rise to inflation. And we know how that inflation is to be managed in the inflation targeting regime by something like a Taylor rule. This interest rate feeds back and stabilizes the economy, activist policy setup. And there's a long-run equilibrium determined by the supply side of the model. And it's a story in which growth occurs by the accumulation of capital. Now, this is what we faced as our benchmark model at the time of the crisis. Its view was that policy is very simple. You simply neutralize demand shocks and technology shocks by the use of monetary policy, and you stabilize inflation as required by the inflation targeting regime. But crucially, this is fundamentally a model that can be thought about as linear, and there's a unique equilibrium. There's very little in the way of any more than that. The model's written down in a nonlinear way, but linearizing it makes not much difference, and there is a unique equilibrium, even if you do it with the full nonlinear details. And the Ramsey growth path is the attractor for this model. You converge back to the Ramsey growth path after any shock, managed by the monetary policy in the model. And the return to equilibrium can be pretty quick. There's just nominal adjustment, nominal rigidities, and costs of adjustment of capital, or in the investment story, those two things. And so you ask, that was the equipment that we had, and I've described how we got there. Does it do the business? And there is it not doing the business. This is a very familiar picture. It shows in the heavy lines I'm looking at a black and white version here. The US is in blue, and dotted line is the projection of trend, the Ramsey growth path equilibrium, and the heavy blue line is what has happened. And the Europe story is the projection of the Ramsey growth path equilibrium and what has happened to Europe in the heavy red line. And there's an analogy to ask yourself in looking at this picture to draw with the two previous crises. In the 1930s, there was unemployment and the model wasn't adequate in thinking about it. And that led to the Keynesian revolution. In the 1970s and 80s, fixed price models weren't adequate, and we got the development of inflation targeting coupled to the microfoundations revolution that went with it. And the question we ask ourselves is, looking at that picture, what do we need to do to have a model that responds to that difficulty? And that's the challenge, essentially, that we set everybody that wrote papers for us in this issue of OXREP. And as I said, there were a lot of different responses, and I'm just going to talk to you about effectively 4 of them, although there'll be some brief reference to some of the others. First thing you can do is add things to the core model, and you can describe these as supply-side shocks to that model. And I think of the secular stagnation hypothesis as doing basically this. The slow recovery has been caused by a lower rate of technical progress, and quite possibly also an increase in savings. No real change to the fundamental ideas in the model, just an exogenous shock to TFP. Long-run outcome is consistent with this story in the previous picture as a result of lower technical progress. And of course, that's the long run. The short run will lead to a very large reduction in investment as the economy adjusts to a lower need for the level of the capital stock. And so you can, in this story, tell the Larry Summers version of the story, which is a short run, very large reduction in demand, driven by this longer term story about technology. Warwick McKibben, sitting in the audience, surprised me to find him here from the other side of the world. He and I talked about Thailand and Korea. It's not a story about Japan, but a reduction in the expected rate of productivity growth in those countries, leading to not just a lower, longer-term rate of growth, but also to a very spectacular short-term fall in investment and then consumption, and confounded by the open economy and then financial market consequences. But you can think about what happened this way. And you can think more recently of the Gordon and Summer story as doing something similar about what's happened in the last few years. And Warwick and his colleague Andy Stokel at the ANU have got a paper in the OXREP issue which goes through this argument. And you can see how you can get a story of this kind. It's possible also that the story about these shocks to the supply side is actually an endogenous story. It might be driven by hysteresis in the labour market, in other forms of hysteresis. And I'm going to talk briefly towards the end about it being driven by reduced investment leading to a reduction in embodied technical progress. It's the first thing that you can do in responding to that blue and white picture, blue and red picture that I produced a few minutes ago. The second thing you can do is add finance to the model. And this is really another change to the supply side of the setup, in which it's more costly to produce output. The first thing you can do is simply impose risk premia. And again, Andy and Andy Stokel's paper in the OXREP issue asks the question, can you reverse engineer what the risk premia should have were in order to give rise to this reduction in both current demand and longer term growth? It's not entirely clear where the risk premia comes from in work like this, but it gives you something to look for in the data, even if you've done it by reverse engineering, given this model, what the risk would have had to be in this model structure to produce such a changed outcome. But you can go beyond this, and I just wanted to mention other work because it's not discussed in OXREP, but I think it's fundamental to this additional set of stories of what you need to add. The first is understanding of how risk premium can become endogenous. And a central story of that endogeneity is how financial institutions relate to each other. This is a network story. Direct contractual linkages, default by one bank creates liquidity and indeed solvency problems for other banks, spreading through the network. And whether this gets into a very bad circumstance or not depends upon the extent of leverage, whether because of leverage you get shock amplification rather than shock absorption in the setup. A new transmission mechanism can emerge in this setup, not present in the basic model, which Brunnermeier, I think, rather helpfully describes as a paradox of prudence. We know Keynes's paradox of thrift. I decide to save more makes it, others wish to save more as well. This story, I decide to reduce asset demand, but for balance sheet reasons myself, and this causes others to do the same. And a magnification of the shocks through balance sheet effects. Many people argue, and I think rightly, that this happened in the housing market, a rollover crisis of the same sort in which there's a spreading of balance sheet risks. And small shock can lead to large propagation. And they can help us to explain that blue and red figure that I described to you. These give rise to very important nonlinearities, especially when solvency and liquidity get connected. There are modeling difficulties, multiple equilibria, quite hard to know how to do this in forward-looking models, multiple rational expectations, forward-looking setups. But there's a fundamental difficulty then about the whole rational expectations forward-looking methodology in that it doesn't any longer identify a unique outcome in the setup. And this calls into question the whole, I think, procedure of such the microfoundations requirement that we took on board so many years ago in response to the 70s and 80s. What might one do, and I make two last comments in relation to this change that's happened, this issue about dealing with the microfoundations requirement. First of all, to ask ourselves how badly might we think that things could go wrong, and how could we create a simple capture of things going wrong. There's a paper in the Oxrep issue by Wendy Cullen and David Soskis, which can also produce something like the blue and red picture, which we could label as Keynesian. It may not be helpful to use that semantic term. It's just a model in which enough things go wrong to give a rather bad outcome. Let's just describe what those things are. It's a story set up in a very simple way in the paper. The economy gets trapped with a nominal interest rate at 0 and with inflation also at 0, very significant negative demand shock causing the inability of monetary policy to deal with this shock, zero bound, and a question which many people have been discussing again recently: what happens when there's a very large negative demand shock? Does inflation become negative and you get disinflation? Answer no, empirically, and there have been good reasons for understanding this. Supposing that there are three more things. First of all, households with precautionary savings who respond to these difficulties by spending less. Secondly, suppose there are strategic complementarities amongst investors so that I find it profitable to invest less when you do, another strategic interaction of the kind that I was talking about earlier in financial markets, but this time between investors. And finally, a story in which technical progress in the form of embodied technological change can give rise to low productivity growth as a consequence of low investment. What can we get in these circumstances? First of all, if things are good, the world goes on exactly as it did before, as described by the simple model that I described, the benchmark model that I described earlier. But if things go not well in the way that I've described with my list, we can end up with a low activity equilibrium with unemployed resources, with no disinflation at the zero bound, with low investment and low productivity growth as a consequence. And Kalinowskis put this forward, I think, with some success as an argument describing what's happened in Britain and Europe over the period since the crisis. You could embed all of this into a full DSG model, and it would in the end converge back to whatever the growth path would be. But the crucial set of things that I identified gives you a simple, if you like, toy model handle on the crucial things that can cause a very bad outcome to emerge. The last thing I want to say about what this tells us, this account that I've given about how to change the way we do macroeconomic theory, relates to those who do policy work in policy institutions. I think important paper by Simon Wren-Lewis in the OXREP issue describes how this microfounded requirement, which I keep coming back and back to, coming originally out of the Lucas critique arguments, how this has had an influence on those who work in policy institutions in constructing policy models. This microfoundations revolution has caused people to ground their work in its fundamental theoretical structure rather than to ground their work as importantly as it used to be grounded in empirical knowledge of the functioning of the economy. The crucial thing to do is to get a model that works with a sensible equilibrium and glue that onto data rather than the way empirical work used to be done, which was to embody an empirical, take an empirical question and ask, how can I build a not very well theoretically formulated structure to understand this? And the Wren-Lewis paper is important in arguing in a way that I can't document now, that this approach to policy modelling had as its implication much less work being understood, being done in Britain in the run-up to the crisis about the vulnerability of the economy to what became a very large financial shock. And in another paper in the OXREP issue, David Hendry and John Muehlbauer take this argument and apply it to work on consumption, which David has done and John have done together for many years. And their argument is a strong one, that the grounding of work on consumption on the Euler equation and then bolting on more and more details has missed, nevertheless, an enormous amount of empirically important things that we still don't properly understand. And because we don't properly understand them theoretically, they've been, to a very large extent, left out of the modelling work that's been done. Illiquid assets, the way consumption relates to housing, how house price booms and collapses happen, these are difficult to model in a fully constructed DSGE setup, and yet they're fundamental in understanding what you need to do to think about policy advice. And their paper makes a case, allied to the Wren-Lewis case, that the way we've thought about doing macro modelling, which, as I've tracked back comes from the structure of the benchmark model that I talked about, has inhibited people from doing work as well as they should have. You can say this is a sociological claim. It needn't have happened this way, but it seems to have. That's their claim, and I think it's persuasive. So what I've done is discuss in 4 sorts of ways, adding more on the supply side, thinking about how to do better on finance, understanding in the Cullen and Soskis way how this might have implications for the whole economic structure in a simple toy model sort of way, and finally understanding what we've learned and its implications for policy modelling. These 4 things are what's come out of the OXREP issue and tell us a lot about what we need to do next. There's no settled story about what to do next, but I think we have to ask whether in 10 years' time we can look back on this last 10 years and ask, will we have learned a changed way of doing things in the way that happened in the 1930s with the Keynesian revolution, or that certainly happened in the 1970s and 1980s in the 2 ways that I've described. That's the task for us going forward over the next decade. Thanks very much.
I think David has done a great job, first of herding all the authors in this special volume, going from DSG devotees to skeptics. And it's really worth reading, as giving you a sense of divergent views, but at the same time, maybe the hope of some convergence at some point. And then I think today has done an amazing job of actually presenting his views, but while being fair to the views of the other authors in the volume, and that's quite an impressive performance. What I thought I would do in my shorter time is just pick and choose various issues which the work, both before I worked with David, as I worked with David, as I listened to David, have come to mind, and then it's the usual reverse. This is a test every time, and I miss, and I fail it totally. So, what I want to do is discuss two sets of issues. The first one is the challenges to macroeconomic theory, and then the second is what sets of models do we need to actually do good macroeconomics. So on the challenges, I've put the challenges in 3 boxes. The ones which I think are easy to repair, or relatively easy to repair, the ones which are not so easy to repair, and then on the next slide, the ones which are really difficult or maybe impossible to repair. On the ones which are easy to repair, and that's where most of the work actually has taken place, is introducing financial considerations. And when you do this, what happens is that you have to just basically start thinking about the funds available to the various actors. So if you think about households, you think about what liquid assets they have on hand, how much of their assets can they use as collateral in order to borrow. So you take into account leverage aspects of decisions for households, for firms. On the lender side, you do the same thing for banks or financial institutions, and leverage capital ratios have become central. So you introduce both this on the borrowing side, the lending side, and you have a finance sector which makes good sense. And I think on this there has been gigantic progress, both in looking at the pieces individually and then putting them in various DSGE type models. I think that was what was probably most urgently needed, but also what was most straightforward to actually accomplish. The second one is, I think, not so easy, which is the need to depart from rational expectations. And the models that we have, and David has been explicit about it, have at the center of them something like the Euler equation, which basically forces consumers to look into the infinite future and be very smart about it. Or it has the uncovered interest parity condition, which also leads investors to look into the infinite future and be very smart about it. And not only is it just too generous a view of our abilities, but it also leads, as David said, to very strong forces to return the equilibrium, the economy, back to something like the Ramsey growth path. And it's clearly counterfactual. My sense is, if you actually think about what is needed, it's two dimensions. The first one is clearly bounded rationality, which is we don't think into the infinite future. We think a few periods ahead. For retirement, we probably think a bit more ahead. For most of the decisions, we have much shorter horizons. Our ability to think about everything we should is just limited. And I think this leads to very different consumption behavior, much more short-sighted, myopic behavior in some dimensions, not in all. The fact that there's a stock market doing some of the pricing for us with investors which presumably look further in the future allows us not to do it, but to use the information from the stock prices to know how rich we are and how much we can save. The other dimension is this clearly some element of adaptive expectations. Most of the time we just look at what happened and just assume it's going to be along the same lines. But I think that in particular for financial crises or financial tensions, I think there is an extrapolative element which is very important. This is one of the things I take from Minsky, which is it starts and then you become more and more optimistic. Once people have seen, a draw from a coin come out heads 10 times, their assessed probability of what will happen next time is surely more than 50%. And if you look at bubbles, this is exactly what happens. There's a sequence of shocks which might be due initially to fundamentals, but people having seen the thing go up by 100% or 200% completely forget that behind this there may have been fundamentals and just extrapolate. And just that way of thinking gives you a very good way of actually looking at bubbles and understanding them. So I think we need this. I think that's central, and that's clearly anathema to the initial approach to macro from the 70s and 80s, which was based on rational expectations. Rational expectations is clearly very useful in various ways, but with these adaptations, which I think are central, not everything is due to shocks plus rational expectations. A lot of it is just the building up of expectations, the turnaround, and so on and so on. But I think that can be done, and if I had more time, I would point to a number of papers which now, using evidence, basically are able to characterize that behavior. I don't think we're at the point where we have a more of a consumer we can use, which has these features, but we're not very far, and my guess is we'll be there in not too long. Now let me get to what I think is much, much, much harder and much more devastating, maybe too strong a word for macro, but challenging. The first one, David mentioned it, is the existence of nonlinearities and multiple equilibria. So the two are related. I mean, you can have nonlinearities but not have multiple equilibria. Nonlinearities may lead to very large effects of small shocks without leading to multiple equilibria, but multiple equilibria is in a way the limit of this. And I think we've learned from the thesis that they really are there. I give two examples of the first, the doom loops between the sovereign and the sovereigns and the financial institutions, which has played a major role in Europe. The state being in bad shape affects the banks, which are very in bad shape. Then they have to be helped by the state, which is in worse shape, and that can get very quickly very nasty and unpleasant. The zero lower bound, or the effective lower bound on rates, is a very important nonlinearities. I mean, this is very much Alice on the other side of the looking glass. once you basically are into the zero lower bound region, unless you can use QE, but there are limits to this. Many of the things that we think go one way actually go the other way. Inflation is good, deflation is terrible, and so on. But the second one, I think, is also very prevalent. We used to basically talk about it in a very specific context of bank runs. So we understood that in the absence of deposit insurance, there could be two equilibria, everybody going to the bank or not. If everybody went to the bank, there was just not enough assets, liquid assets, and the bank had to close. We understood this. We thought we were done, basically, with deposit insurance. What we've realized is that can happen in many places beyond banks. As soon as there is mismatch of maturity, there is a risk of multiple equilibria. And once we have that, it's very difficult to know, how to predict what's going to happen. Typically, what happens in the malls, there is a region in which there cannot be multiple equilibria because there is not much mismatch. But very quickly, there is one which is very large. And then what happens there is entirely undetermined by the mall, and it can happen, it cannot happen. We think that, we hope that we can kind of get a better sense of a probability that it happens, but even there, that's very fuzzy. And if this is important to the world, then that makes macro forecasting very difficult. The other one, the second challenge, is even worse, which is that there are environments and events in which you actually have to understand the granular structure of the economy. You need to know exactly who does what with whom. And I give you 3 examples, I think, or 2 examples. The first one we saw at the time of Lehman, which is when Lehman went down, basically who was exposed to Lehman and who was, as a result, exposed to the people exposed to Lehman was not understood, very difficult to understand, even by the players themselves. Very many of them had not anticipated. And in order to understand what happened, which we never really did, right, you needed to understand all the interactions between all the players at the granular level. It was not enough to know that A had a claim on B. It could be that A was selling assets at fire sales prices, and that had an effect on B, which had an effect on C. And so in that case, in order to understand exactly what was happening and to take measures, basically you had to understand something you did not understand, maybe the granular structure of our relations. I had seen this in another context before. I had seen this in the early 90s in Eastern Europe, in which there was a collapse of output, which ex ante we had not anticipated. We thought if we let prices work, then, yes, there would be some adjustment, but basically it would go up. There were enormous collapses in output, and it came from the fact that one supplier disappeared, and then there was nobody left. It had been organized in chains of production in which there was no redundancy. So one supplier going down killed the whole chain, and it turned out, I think this was the main explanation. And again, the amount of information needed to understand that would have been enormous. We just didn't have it. And then I'll give another example, which came from a discussion we had last week at the Friday lunch here at the Peterson on a completely different topic, which was what happens if there is a conflict on the Korean Peninsula. So that looks a bit away from macro. But it turned out, so think of a limited conflict, something which basically makes it difficult to ship things in and out of Korea, but not much worse, right? Well, what would happen is the global supply chains would be basically disturbed, and some of the suppliers which are in Korea could not actually supply. And what we concluded, and this was based on discussions with Toyota the day before, is that we don't know what would happen if suddenly North Korea or South Korea were excluded from international trade. Again, what would be needed here is an understanding of supply chains to the degree of granularity that neither the players nor us as macroeconomists have. So to the extent that these are important, and they're surely important in the financial sector, as I said in the last slide, it's nearly an existential challenge to macro as such, because macro is based on the assumption that you can just look at consumers as a whole or two groups or something like this, but you don't need to know who is sleeping with whom. That's just not maybe relevant. So this I see as, I think we can solve the first two. I think we can think about the first of these, but the other one scares me to death. So let me move to the other set of issues that I want to talk about. And I've written about this before, and some of you may already have been exposed to it, but I think it's an important point. It's more about what needs to be done and the sociology of a profession. This was written in reaction to the imperialism of DSGE models, which until very recently were seen as the only way to actually do modeling, at least as seen by the editors of major journals. And my sense is completely wrong, that macro is a very complex field in which we have to go at it in very different ways. So I've listed 5 sets of models, and I think they are all essential. I think I use all of them at various points, depending on what I need, but let me just go through it. The first one is forecasting. And many people outside the profession think that what we do is forecasting. That's not what we do. Yeah, forecasters who do that. But basically, there is no need for theory. And theory is useful only if it helps. And for the most part, it doesn't help much. I took the analogy to, the programs for chess or for Go or for translation. They are not based on theory. They are not based on syntax. They are basically on repetition, what works, what doesn't work, and self-learning. And the programs which started from, and the translation programs which started from grammatical structure have all failed. So, forecasting is needed, but theory is not needed for forecasting, or at least not necessarily. The second is, how do you organize, when you're thinking about a topic, how do you organize your thoughts? You want to understand the basic facts. The basic facts come in the form of covariances and correlations between variables. And you have to have some way of organizing the inquiry. And for this, Sims invented the VARs that assume stationarity or something like this. And it's not always right, but it's a way of looking at the data which tells you about correlation. Structural VARs is an attempt to have a slightly more causal view of a set of correlations you're looking at by making assumptions as to what causes what, and goes one more step in the direction of giving you a way of thinking about what is it that you want to explain. It seems to me that's absolutely essential to do before you do theoretical work, and it's essential when you've done theoretical work to go back and see whether you can actually fit it. But again, that's not based on much theory except for the identification of restrictions that you may need to do structural VARs. Then you have more formal DSGs. And I think there the name of the game is that they have to stay close to theory, however defined, but then it means that they have to stay away from exactly fitting all the facts. The kind of DSG in which you add assumptions until you exactly fit the facts, I think defeat the purpose of having a clean theoretical structure in which you can discuss theoretical issues. And I think that should be the role of the DSGs. Then you have the more traditional models, the econometric models. And I think they are on the other side. They basically they really want to stay close to the facts because they actually have to have convincing counterfactuals, for example, which you can only do if, in the first place, you've done okay describing the facts. But then it's clear that you have to take some liberty from theory. The distributed lag structures that we observe in the data are very hard to explain from the point of view of theory. They depend on aggregation and all kinds of things. Very difficult. And then you have the last ones, which are, I call the pedagogical or the toy models, which I've given you a list of them here. Ramsey, overlapping generation model, ISLM, Mundell-Fleming, New Keynesian, Mera-Prescott. I would add some of the models that John was doing many years ago, which were a bit bigger than that, but not much. But you could see the structure just by looking. And I think these models are tremendously useful, both probably before you actually do the more formal stuff and after, in simplifying, telling you this is really what's important. I think these models really are needed. And they make the dialogue much easier and much richer. So this is just a plea for keeping all these models alive, accepting them depending on what the purpose is. Again, I see some progress, but I think more could be done. Let me stop here, and then I think we move here and answer questions or something like this.
Jessica, thank you, David. Thank you, Olivier. Since we're fortunate to have in the audience today at least two people whose work was repeatedly invoked, John Taylor and Warwick McKibben, maybe I could ask if they want to offer any comments at this point. Not required. Sure. Jessica, if you could use the microphone there, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, and that was an excellent overview from both of the speakers. Very pleased to be involved in this project, and I learned a great deal. I had two issues which I think you didn't touch on, which were also raised in my paper. One was the role of heterogeneous agents. That is more than a representative consumer, more than a representative firm. If you look at the CGE literature, computable general equilibrium literature, you can think of that as a heterogeneous agent model. Many different types of firms that behave differently, many different types of consumers that behave differently. You can actually build a macro model, which is what we have in the G-cube model, which takes that into account. Now, it requires a lot of complexity. And there's nothing wrong with complexity if you understand it in a theoretically transparent way. And so I think the model which Olivier left out is very large scale DSGE type models that come from the CGE literature, which deal with heterogeneous agents. It's helpful because you've got the issue of rational expectations that you raised. You could have some agents that are forward-looking and rational and some that aren't, and that gives you the nice interaction between the backward-looking agents and forward-looking agents, Campbell, Mankiw, and a whole range of literature that suggests that. So that's the first issue, is I think you've left a few things out. The second issue is, if you look at what was the build-up between 2000 and 2009, if you look at the data, the big shocks in the global economy were big shifts in relative prices. Food prices, energy prices, durable manufacturing, non-durable manufacturing prices, 600%, 700% changes because of what was happening in China and the emerging countries and how they filtered through the world economy. Now, in a macro model with the only relative price is labour, and if you're lucky, two countries, you might have a relative price of two types of goods, the macro misses those relative price shocks and they all end up in the residuals. And I think again, that's an argument for having heterogeneity. Many sectors, many countries, a complicated world, but the world is complicated, and I think the models we build need to be a bit more complicated than the sort that you've talked about for doing serious macro analysis and the impacts of shocks.
Thank you. David, do you want to?
I agree with that. I think that what you showed in the paper that you wrote for us was just how important these relative price shocks can be. And the challenge which I think you meet is to build structures which makes it possible to think coherently about this increased complexity.
Olivier?
Yeah. On the heterogeneity issue, there's no question that we need heterogeneity. I mean, a financial system in which everybody is the same doesn't play a major role. So we need lenders, we need borrowers. So we now have those. Mike Woodford has helped develop the structure, and there are many papers. So we can have some heterogeneity along these lines, or we can have smart people and not less smart people in terms of expectations. We can do all these things. That doesn't go all the way to what I was talking about, which is granularity, in which you actually have to understand exactly who individually does what. And I think that's a different world. I'm skeptical. So I think some of the people at the conference that David organized said agent-based models can do it. Yeah, I mean, they can do it in principle. They cannot do it in reality. I mean, I think it's just, again, you'd have to have a model which is about as complex as the economy itself, in which case not much has been achieved. So, yeah, heterogeneity is central. And I think it's increasingly in the model. On relative prices, I think I disagree. I mean, I think that at least some of us thought really hard about the effect of the price of oil, including writing a large number of papers on that topic. So, but you're completely right. I mean, I don't think this creates major conceptual issues, of the sort that we were discussing. It's clear that relative prices are important. It's clear that the movements in the price of oil matter a whole lot, but not just oil. But I see this as fairly straightforward. I mean, I would have put this in the easy repairs if it wasn't there already. But I agree with you, it's important.
Okay. John? Jessica, if you give to that gentleman.
Yeah, thank you, like work. I enjoyed all this, and this heterogeneity aspect I think is so important to think about. I actually think about it in the wage price sector, which we have this one equation, almost all these models. It's ridiculous. It just cannot be right. And there's lots of almost big data type of things that tell us about the heterogeneity of wages, prices, and you can simplify, Olivier, but it's still, we're missing a lot, I think. I think one thing that is missing from these interesting presentations is that it may be that the models were fine. What was bad was the policy. There's no even a possibility mentioned of that here. And I think that's the issue. I think obviously models need to be improved a lot, and I agree with just about every suggestion that's made, but I think there was a big policy error to start this whole thing off. I'm not the only one. And I think the slow recovery is also related to that. So I think that whatever you want to think about, you have to bring policy into this discussion. You just can't ignore it completely. I think there's a challenge in testing whether some of the suggestions work. There's a nice paper by Smets and Vader's section of the Handbook of Macroeconomics that takes their model and adds the financial accelerator and other risks to it. And they show it still has problems in terms of explaining the depth of the recession. So I think that's, it's important to, with whatever suggestion is made within a particular model, to bring that into the modeling framework that people are using, whether it's Warwick's or Christian Eichelman and Evans, whatever it happens to be. And there's ways to do that. This Volcker-Wieland's database, model database, which any theory you have, you can see how it works in the existing models. So in the, Olivier, I agree completely, all these models shouldn't be illegal. I do think there's another way to organize your thinking about models, and that is how they interface with policy. So I'm interested in how central banks are big users of the models. They're not the only ones, but the connection between the decisions made by the policymakers and the models themselves. I think sometimes there's a wide gap. It's almost ignored. Sometimes it's close. And the choice of the models, I mean, if a good policymaker should be able to have some influence that the model is useful. It's not just a joke. It's used in policy. So I would stress that in terms of what's the model being used for? And to me, it's policy. Monetary policy is one example, and build the models with that goal in mind, and make sure you have the interface with the policymakers correct.
Thank you.
Yeah. So John, I'm not going to go into the policy errors discussion. I know your views and you know mine. But on the models, I don't think you can say the models were fine. They clearly were not fine. I mean, the models that we had in 2008 were missing where the action was. So, leaving aside whether there were policy errors, there was clearly shortcomings of models. I think you're absolutely right that the way to think about how the central banks should use the models, if I go through my list, it seems to me that they have to use all five. And they actually use all five. I mean, take the Fed. The staff, I think, uses, I will stand corrected by, where is my co-author, Chris? Here. Uses basically two models, right? I mean, they use FRB US for the most part, but there's a DSG group, which I think tries to basically give some input, and then the board. I suspect the discussion at the board, I've not been there, you have, Chris has, is much more along the lines of toy models, basically ISLM type discussions at the board, where people have this model in mind and then just use it to discuss. And so, and again, when it comes to forecasting, I think that, if it works, it works. So I think all 5 models are basically essential to the running of a central bank. And I know the wars of religion between the DSG and the more traditional models. It seems to me it's wrong. They just are different products. They allow for different discussions.
Let me just add to that 5 sets of models. I grew up and began work with the Stone group in Cambridge, in which it's a very big model, it's quite input-output structure, but apart from that, it was quite hard to see how it all fitted together. One room, someone did exports, another room, someone did consumption, and the person that did imports didn't relate very well to the person that did consumption, and so on. I got hold of the Phillips curve and realized with this one equation I could change the whole of the 300 equation structure of the model with no base, and started playing games with reverse engineering what the coefficients in the Phillips curve ought to be in order to produce sensible simulations, and then seeing whether the estimation would allow me to do that. And I was one of those who found the move towards the benchmark New Keynesian model mid-career enormously satisfying, in that I'd grown up in a jumble, and gradually it all began to come together into a clear structure. And there are many who went further than I did in thinking that this gave them grounds to set off on the religious wars and outlawing everything else. I think the important thing we've learned is that although it's very attractive to have a structure imposed, just imposing that structure is a huge mistake. And this claim that you need different things for different purposes is a really important claim.
Can I try to be a little bit more provocative, just building on John's comment? I agree we don't want to rehash the well-established debate about whether there were major policy mistakes causing the crisis, in the crisis, and so on. But I think we do want to pick up on something that comes out of that point, which is, David was saying yesterday when he presented here that part of the reason you took on this project was because you were teaching, I think, undergrads, and they were asking you, what the hell do these models have to do?
And grads as well.
And grads. So one thing which I've encountered dealing with civilians, let's call them, is enormous frustration, worse than ever in my life, about the old 2 economists, 3 opinions problem, right? So a civilian will come up to me and say, John Taylor says this, Olivier Blanchard says this, they're completely opposite with respect to monetary policy. Or tax cuts, CBO says this, CEA says that, just to pick up an example. And it is extremely frustrating for your average normal human being, or for that matter, your non-macroeconomic labor economist, to sort of confront the fact that nobody seems to have a killer argument one way or the other. So while you're here saying we should have all 5 models, we should let 1,000 flowers bloom, we should do all this, is there any hope of like maybe having some sort of adjudication that somebody's right and somebody's wrong on some of these policy issues? Now, again, I'm sharing John's bias that I think the policy issue is what matters, and that's fine. But I mean, are you guys just basically giving up on the idea that we can have a sort of common assessment of what's an established result and what's not an established result?
No. I spend a lot of my time trying to understand why there are differences, pinning them down to different factual beliefs, and seeking evidence to try and determine which of these views is correct. I think that's our task as an empirical science, in the end, to try and do that. Some of the civil wars emerge because it becomes hard to know how to determine who's right or who's wrong from what we know of the empirical data. But I think our task to go on trying. That's not a helpful answer, but I think
Well, it's at least a hopeful answer.
Yeah.
Olivier?
He said no, I would say yes. I mean, there is now this survey of economists, which is run from Chicago Business School, in which questions are asked, not all on macro, but some on macro. And, you know, there's a distribution, but it's fairly tight very often. So we agree on a lot, but clearly what is most visible is what we disagree about. I mean, the journalists have a very strong incentive to go for where we do not agree. Are we going to always agree, even if all of us are honest scientists? I think that economics in general is a Bayesian exercise in which you come with your priors, which were delivered to you in your genes and your parents' education, and whether they were on the left or on the right. Then I think we can more or less agree on the maximum likelihood, on the likelihood function. But in the end, we're not going to end up in the same place. And John Cochrane and I can look at the same things, agree on most of it, and come up with different answers. It's a social science. Mm-hmm. And so I think that part will never be resolved. In addition, some questions are extremely difficult. And we really cannot say whether it's 1 or 0, black or white. But I'm more optimistic than you are, I think.
I was trying to be provocative. I wasn't being optimistic or pessimistic. Another comment or question from the audience, please.
Robert Owen, University of Nantes in France, currently visiting Georgetown. First of all, thank you to both David and Olivier for a real tour de force and the clarity of the discussions, was obviously very complex sets of issues. Nonetheless, I think that even the title of your project, Rethinking Macroeconomics, is reflecting a deeply ingrained fallacy in existing economic thinking, which is that we want to rethink economics as a whole. So the key conceptual challenges I think that economics face is the nature of the interface between micro and macro, but also macro to micro. And what seems to me very striking about the way thinking has gone is that we've focused mostly on micro to macro, but there are issues of closure and so on which can enable us to explain the underpinnings of the nonlinearities and other issues that have been mentioned here. Thank you.
Thank you. Another comment or question? Please, over there.
Peter Sturm, I'm a retired OECD economist, and I would like to thank the presenters for a very informative survey of the ongoing discussion, which, however, did not cover what I expected to be covered. When I signed up for this lecture, I thought you would deal with the Kahneman-Tversky challenge to economics in general and to the assumption of rational behavior in particular. And now, not having read the economic papers articles, I would like to ask you what the relationship between these articles and their analysis is to the Kahneman-Tversky critique. And before you dismiss my question as completely irrelevant, I would like to quote Peter Diamond, who said he looked at the Kahneman-Tversky stuff. He thinks it's extremely important. He tried to integrate it into conventional economics and said he was incapable of doing so. So I would like your comment on that.
And let me supplementarily try to rephrase it. How much stock do you give to the idea that the problem isn't obsession with microfoundations, which is, I guess, Simon Wren-Lewis's point of view, versus just having the wrong microfoundations in terms of belief formation? I mean, that's not your entire question, but just another way of bridging it to them.
That might be right, but I don't yet understand how to do this other belief formation story. What I know of it is not enough, but suggests that it's easy to rationalize many observed behaviors, reverse engineering the kind of beliefs that you would have thought gave rise to such behavior, and trying to prevent just doing that descriptive exercise is difficult. One way of very loosely defending the kinds of claims made by Mühlbauer and Hendry that I discussed at the end of my talk is there are many behaviors that it's impossible to get out of a representative agent or even many agent optimizing framework of the straightforward kind. It must be because of some other form of beliefs, but that's very nearly empty. I think there's a challenge to try and go beyond that emptiness. I'm not the person to describe how to do it, but I think it's important.
Start with yours. I agree. I mean, nobody can be against microfoundations. They just have to be the right ones. Although somebody might...
No, I think somebody in the review was against it.
We would like to explain things from first principles, if we could, and we should try. At the same time, there's a separate issue, which is suppose we do. So suppose that we now have a completely accurate description of Adam Possen's behavior. Difficult, but conceivable, right?
It's a random walk with bad drift. But anyway.
The question is, okay, when I write the consumption function, do I insist on having Adam Posen and David Vines and everybody else and then aggregate? Or do I say, well, let me just take a step and make simple assumptions which capture what I've learned from these guys, but no longer micro-founded, kind of micro. So I think that's a separate issue. I mean, we clearly want to understand why people do things. So I think there's no issue there, right?
Well, Joe's waiting to ask a question, but let me just push back for you a second, right? In a potted history of physics, there was a long period, go back to say Kepler and Tycho Brahe, in which you were determining empirically that the motion of the planets was an ellipse in the system and it wasn't a circle. And we didn't know what were the microfoundations of gravity. We just had this force called gravity that we said was doing this. And most of us presumed that was useful. And it may have been that in Tycho Brahe's head or Kepler's head that someday there will be quantum gravity and we will know what actually is the source of gravity. But for a few centuries, physics seemed to do useful stuff without assuming microfoundations.
But physics has been looking for the why of all these things and keeps going. And so this is a search for microfoundations in physics, if you want. But that's just, I'm debating rather than discussing it. On your point, you now have sat down, I think we're making much progress in the sense of integrating, what I would call behavioral, which is not just expectations or risk behavior, but I think, Dick Thaler had the Nobel Prize for a reason. He basically showed a number of issues which the standard model could not adjust. I think we've passed that. At the last AEA meetings, there was a Ailey lecture by David Leibson on hyperbolic discounting, which is clearly something that most people seem to be subject to, and he showed some of the implications. There was a paper by Xavier Gabex on bounded rationality in New Keynesian model. We're not there, but I think we've passed the point of having anecdotes, which we don't quite know what to do with, to building some model of consumption, which is not going to work everywhere all the time, but is going to be much more realistic that maximize E of U, which is a model that we've been using until now. So I think it's coming. Well, I'm going to be, again, classified as an incurable optimist, but I'm optimistic on that one.
Okay, Joe.
Joe Gagnon here at the Institute. My question is, in terms of advancing macroeconomics, you can think of that as explaining the residuals to some extent. I guess my question is, to what extent is it more than that or not? And the reason I mention that is that we can disagree on what caused, if bad policy caused the crisis or and which policies it was. But when the crisis hit, I'm struck by, if you look at the minutes or the transcripts of the meetings, with the models the Fed had in hand at that time in real time, Janet Yellen said in the FOMC meeting of March 2009 that her models were telling her the rules, they weren't exactly your rule, John, but they were rules in the spirit of your rule that were based on historical theory and historical regularities. And she said, my model is telling me I want a Fed funds rate of -6%. And then we saw attempts to achieve that in some way through quantitative easing, which the Fed now calculates were equivalent after a lag of 4 years to -2%. And so then the result we got, which was a very slow recovery, is completely predictable and explainable in the context of models we had in real time. So, is that, in other words, what I'm saying is all we're doing explaining the residual, but the model still was useful? Or do you actually think that that was not a good interpretation of what happened?
My sense is, again, remember the zero lower bound. It was seen as an exotic thing which would never happen. So in that sense, it was wrong. But we had a model in which we had introduced the zero lower bound. Given this and the limits to monetary policy despite QE, yes, I think we had a model which could explain the recovery fairly well. I think the other element that David mentioned is I think we also became less optimistic about the future during the recovery because of the slowdown in productivity growth that led people and firms to be more reluctant. So I think that model worked well. I think that where the model didn't work is 2008 and 2009. That's the part. But after this, the recovery doesn't raise issues which I think are impossible to explain and can be explained within the class of models we now have.
Okay, David, you get the last word.
I think that it was hard to go to the full extent in the way that you would want of that story. Putting the zero bound into the models clearly slowed everything down. But I think we need also Olivier's point about not optimizing into the future, but some limits to rationality to get as big a sense of what went wrong. Because there was running these models with a zero lower bound, the hope for the future when you finally get there casts a very big shadow back to the present. And you have to make a number of important restrictions to stop that optimism of when we get there, pulling us back to, we understand the zero lower bound, but it's not going to produce as big a difficulty as we think.
Okay. Thank you all very much for coming out for a somewhat more academic, but I think ultimately very rich and informative discussion, and we're proud to have been able to put it on. Thank you to Olivier. Thank you especially to David for making the trip and bringing us live and in person the insights, the issues of OxRep. Again, the link is on our website. Download it while you can, while it's free.
You've got a week to download everything.
Will you please go crazy? We also have hard copies of their particular papers, and we look forward to continuing the discussion both as in all 5 dimensions that Olivier mentioned. So thank you very much.